Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth episode of Beyond the Board. We're going to be talking today with Steve Reid. And I'm really excited to welcome Steve to this conversation today. Steve's got over 25 years of experience in leading software engineering teams, but also maybe and equally noteworthy, you probably have more dirt on Dan and Pratik than I don't. Is that comparable with like the dirt you might have on them, like spouses have more, or does Steve Reid have more? I feel like.
Question of the day. Well, and they equally have as much or more on me, so that's a
Okay.
double-edged sword, right?
All right. Yeah, that's fair. So I won't ask any questions because that could be asked by you. Steve, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I started my career at a company that some of you are probably familiar with, Blockbuster. And I'm in Fort Lauderdale, and Blockbuster Corporate used to be in downtown Fort Lauderdale, and I worked as an engineer there for I think 3 or 4 years. They packed up and moved to Texas. I didn't want to make that move. I went to a company in North Miami where I spent 3 or 4 years. And then they were going through a technology change, which is a hands-on keyboard engineer. It just wasn't the technology I loved. So I actually switched over to work for, at the time, what was a small software company called Ultimate Software. And so I arrived there in March of 2000 and spent close to 25 years there before I moved on to where I am now, which is actually with Trimble. And so I think today we're largely going to talk about the work that was done at Ultimate Software.
Yeah, that's where the dirt comes from, right?
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So before we dig in here, I think it would be great to just set the stage a little bit for what things you were seeing at Ultimate, and after being there for such a long period of time, you got to see a lot of growth, a lot of change. But what did it look like as you were starting to explore Kanban and Kanban practices? What was the kind of landscape for the organization and the teams?
Yeah, and I think I'm even going to go a step earlier than that. So when I arrived there in March of 2000, it was the first software company that I'd worked for. The previous companies were, IT shops where we were a cost center, not the revenue producing side of the organization. So in many respects, it felt like, we kind of landed in the big leagues at this software company. And so I got there, I was assigned a bunch of maintenance tickets to start working on a security subsystem, and, working through those for, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And every morning I had a guy who used to come and print out the tickets that were assigned and left them on my chair. And he did that for every single person in engineering. So you got your hand delivered tickets that were assigned to you, and working along. And then all of a sudden, one day they start talking about code freeze is coming, and which seemed like a big panic because I still had a whole bunch of tickets assigned to me and I didn't really know what that meant. So I ran and grabbed my boss and I was like, code freeze, I've still got all this work. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. That's just the first time we try to build. And I was like, oh, okay. So I've just been coding, compiling, checking into version control, but they haven't been building the product. So it probably took a month before they got the build right. And then we're still working through stuff. And that first release, I wasn't assigned a ton of work that would have been so impactful for the release. So from my perspective, it went just fine. Subsequent releases, that same guy would deliver my tickets in the morning, and then he would stop by maybe 25% of the way through the release. And we were doing like 2 or 3 releases a year. So, he would stop by after a month or two and ask, hey, Steve, we're at the 25% mark. Where do you feel you are in terms of your overall, your scope of delivery? And I would kind of turn around and look at him, and I didn't really know how to answer that question. So I would kind of say, I think I'm at 25%. And he felt great. I felt great. He checked the box, but, he left, and there was always this, I guess I'm at 25%. I don't know. So same thing happened at 50%, same thing happened at 75%, and inevitably around the 80% mark is when engineering let people know, oh, things really aren't on track. Like we're not going to get some stuff done. And back in those days, it was so early, it's like 2000-ish, pre-SaaS. We were a license revenue business model, and I don't think we realized on the engineering side um, how impactful those things were going to be to the business, right? Because you had a couple of large clients that were going to go live, and they were requiring things that were supposed to be in a release. And if you missed those dates, it could push them from one quarter to the next, which really, we were a publicly traded company that had a very direct impact on how we were perceived by Wall Street and everything else. So we kind of followed that path for a few years. And it was sometime in around the 2004 timeframe that actually it was some of the product folks who were going to the conferences and starting to hear about an alternate method, and it was really Scrum. And so they came back and said to the business, we really think we need to actually switch and follow this agile route. And so it was, I guess, a little unheard of back in 2005 for an enterprise software company to be changing up things like that.
Yeah.
The engineering team was a little dubious, I would say. There were no double-blind university studies. How can we be doing this? We've been doing this for so long. This just doesn't make any sense. But we brought in one of the sort of stalwarts of the Scrum community, and we trained the entire team on the Scrum process, and we started with Scrum. And truthfully, it actually made a lot of things better, right? The visibility into the releases that we were dropping the ball at the last minute was all of a sudden gone. The business had much more visibility on a bi-weekly or monthly basis into what we were progressing on. They got to see it, the software, relatively working in real time and make decisions if it was right or wrong. So all of that part got better. Things that weren't working for us, and we had a bunch of we initially had a bunch of problems with like our builds and pipelines and stuff, and we had to go solve all of those problems. But once we got past that, there were a couple things that weren't working. Interruptions that were coming in from support, and we were a payroll company, right? So I always like to use the analogy for people who don't really understand the software and the software world, that like if we produced games for the iOS platform and we released a bug or we had a problem in production, we could very easily say we're sprinting, we'll get to that next iteration, next sprint. But when you have people's payroll on the line, you can't say we're in the middle of a sprint, we'll get to that at the end of this iteration. So we were constantly being interrupted, but it wasn't predictable enough that we could plan for those interruptions. So the first couple times that happened, the teams would bury themselves to meet their sprint deliverables. But as it became more normal, the teams were kind of failing sprints, and that failing mindset became kind of normal and was always bothersome. There were a couple of other things that were happening. We picked our team size based on that sort of ideal guidance of a Scrum team of like 5 to 9 people, and we kind of stuck to that. But we also had to act very quickly when local, state, and federal laws changed and had fixed delivery dates that we had to meet. There was no option to say we're not going to meet that, because that's how the government generated their taxation, and we had to have the code in place and live by a certain date and time. So what we ended up doing was falsely dividing a backlog amongst multiple teams. And so we basically would say, okay, you 3 teams are all going to do part of this, and the transaction cost, the coordination cost of doing that, if someone got sick, if something happened, it put a lot of stuff in jeopardy. So that wasn't ideal. And so that was another problem. And then probably the biggest one, the promise of Scrum when it was pitched to the business was this thing called hyperproductivity, right? Like, you guys can go hyper productive. And at the time it was a 2x or more increase in velocity. And when you go to a C-suite and say, for the same investment in people, you can get 2x or more done, they want that. And so we felt like we were kind of constantly chasing, the hyper productivity, and we got a lot, right? We got more visibility, we got more predictable. We were still struggling with a couple things, but we never got that hyper productivity. And so we ran like that for a while. We eventually decided it was time to reboot Scrum. So we brought in one of the co-creators of Scrum, who, again, trained the entire team. We did refine a couple things along the way. We made Scrum Masters a full-time fixed role versus sort of a part-time role. We doubled down on everything else. And again, there was that promise of you can go hyper-productive. And we never saw that. So the second time we didn't see that happen. And this would have been like in the 2004, 2005 timeframe.
So
And
was that time of starting Scrum, rebooting Scrum? It sounds like it was a couple of
a
years.
couple of years, yeah,
Okay.
couple of
Okay.
years. And like I said, things were better. They just weren't where we wanted to be. The Agile Conference 2008 was in Toronto that year, and it just so happened I walked into a session, and it was a terrible session, and it was like, oh, what's going on around me? And I walked to the section next to me, and it ended up being Corey Lattice talking about Scrum Ban,
Okay.
and a lot of the stuff he was talking about really resonated. But we had literally just finished this reboot of Scrum 2.0, and here was like this new, okay, this sounds like it could potentially solve a lot of our problems, but we've just introduced this huge change into the organization. It's not the right time, but let's track this. Like, let's watch what's going on in this Kanban community and see. And back then it was like a Yahoo dev group and not much information, but we were watching it closely. And we ended up having a scaling meeting every day called the Daily Product Review. And the Daily Product Review had like the sort of the scrum master, lead process engineer from each team with the product folks talking through impediments. And we had a period of like 2 months where one team was the impediment to pretty much every other team every day. And it was a team that provided the infrastructure and everything else. The other teams needed to do their work. And
Yeah.
so every day they were the impediment. They were the impediment. And so, after a couple months of like, hey, this isn't getting better, some of the leaders went down and kind of looked at what was going on in the team. And it was really obvious they had way too much whip. And they didn't have any kind of cross-functional training, and it was sort of obvious what the problem was. So we ended up layering Kanban on top of this team without really telling them that's what we were doing. And it was really all about a way of controlling whip, and then dealing with the cross-functional training that we needed to do. And really quickly, that team was no longer the impediment. So we
Okay.
went from, sort of months of it being the impediment to that's no longer the impediment. And so that was the first introduction to anything Kanban. And then, Colleen, I don't know if you have any other questions, right? What would you like me to transition into, sort of how it then evolved into a broader use of Kanban?
Yeah, well, I'd love to ask a little bit more about that specific team and their starting point. I mean, I would imagine after a few years of trying to roll Scrum out and rebooting Scrum, there was probably also a little bit of change fatigue, or just skepticism, perhaps, of like whether or not these things were going to help. Where did you start for that particular team in terms of introducing change or changing up their process in a way that they welcomed?
For that first team, we almost didn't tell them that's what we were doing. Like,
Yeah.
we just said, hey, we're going to try to solve some of the problems you're having, and put a board in there. We put some visualization without saying we're changing your process. And I think that was one of the keys to making that team successful, was just not even to say we're changing anything, just we
Yeah.
got to solve a business problem, and here's how we think we can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that a lot with groups we've worked with and organizations I've worked with over the years. And sometimes I think just starting there is a great place to get some data in front of people to start asking different questions, right? So that somebody goes, wait a minute, this feels broken, or what are we doing here? Like you said, from a WIP perspective, making that really visible that we're pulling work in and nothing's leaving is usually a great catalyst for saying this, the way that we're working is not working, right? So we need to consider something different. So you said that team was the team that it started. As you started adding practices for them, what were the things that kind of got the other teams to take notice?
So it was really, we watched that one for a couple months, and then the business, we still had all these smaller scrum teams, and the business itself actually came to us and said, I've got these two teams working on, two smaller complementary products to the whole HR payroll suite. But really, one of the two products is more important than the other. So we'd actually like to put the second product on hold and move all of the resources to work on, the one that's that's the higher priority to us. And it's so high priority to us that we're actually willing to do that with a third team. And so now it was the first time that we were kind of facing that, okay, they want to take about 20 to 25 people. They would like to put it on one large team. And the person who we had picked out to lead the team happened to be one of the few people in the organization at the time who was looking at process stuff as much as we were. And he actually came to us and said, hey, I really would like to try Kanban with this team, which we were dying to try it with a bigger, group and see what we would get. So we jumped all over that opportunity. We put the three teams together in a large co-located space, and we started running Kanban with them. Uh, and the results were fantastic. I mean, we all the transactional and coordinational costs that we had when we were falsely dividing backlogs started to disappear. At the time, we were all co-located in one location, so it made it very easy to just put a large physical board on the wall and run off of that large physical board and change things on the fly. And we were so happy with what we were seeing that that's when we made the decision. Hey, we're having these problems with the falsely divided work and the interruptions and the failing sprints all over the place. Why don't we try? Like, why don't we give this attempt to roll this out across the board? And so that's what we did. We brought in a thought leadership on the Kanban side. We trained all of the leaders of each of the team and the management group. And then we sort of took it from that point, we took it ourselves and rolled it out sort of on a team to team basis. We took everybody off site for a day or two, and walked through what we were changing, why we were changing it, what it was going to look like. Let's design the board. Let's put WIP limits in place. And then, left it to the team to go back and sort of execute that, physically on the walls in the team rooms.
Yeah, I love your call out there about the team size too, because I think one of the things we see a lot of teams, they try to keep those small teams in place as they start to implement Kanban. And as soon as we start to map those workflows out for the teams, we realize that there's maybe two or three teams that are touching one workflow. And it's like, well, why would you separate all of this out into separate teams if you're all collaborating on getting work done anyway? And it creates a lot of unnecessary handoffs, like you described, where work from one team has to be reprioritized then for another team. So you're just kind of introducing your own delays into the system there by trying to stick to a smuller team size. I think there can be a lot of fear for a lot of organizations in tackling something with a team that's 20, 30 people, though. Did you run into any hiccups related to the size of that team or the amount of work that was going through the board?
The initial hiccups were really all around the cultures that were formed within these small scrum teams. And now you take three teams and you say, hey, you're one large team, and we expect you to work as a team. And so there was a period of probably, I'm going to say, 6 months where they were physically co-located but still operating as three small teams within that structure, and those walls and comfort level took a while to sort of evolve and become the norm, right? The sort of forming, storming, norming. It took a while for that to become one cohesive team. And then the benefits beyond from that point on were the things that I talked about, like the interruptions, right? Like now we were tracking things like cycle time. We had we knew more or less based on that when teams or pairs were going to finish work. And so when something came in from support, we at least had the opportunity to have the conversation with support of, hey, this thing has come in. I have a pair that's going to finish up likely later today. Can I wait until later today before we pull this ticket into something we're actively working on, or do I really have to interrupt the team? And 50 to 75% of the time we could wait. And so we weren't dealing with the context switching or any of the problems we were dealing with before, because we weren't planning work that we couldn't get to when we had interruptions. Teams didn't feel like they were failing the iterations. So it just all of that was fantastic. And then I would say it was the first time we started to see that hyper productivity. Right. So the thing that we've been chasing for years, when we really went back and sort of in the 6 month, 1 year time frame looked at it, we could see that the teams were doing about 2x more than they were before. And one word of caution on that, we didn't share that so publicly, right? Because what we didn't want to have happen, we knew inside the leadership team, what we didn't want to have happen though was people realize, oh, that's what they're after, and people start to falsely slice things or make things manipulated so that it looks like they're doing more. So we kept that one kind of under close wraps of, hey, we really are doing much better with this from a throughput standpoint. And my boss, there's so many times that he wanted to go to like our all hands meetings and put that data up there, and I just wouldn't let him. I was like, I don't. You can share anything else, cycle time, anything else. I don't want you to put that throughput number up there because I don't want people to falsely react to it.
Yeah. Well, and what you just mentioned too about the psychology of feeling like you're failing in your sprints, I think is something I've seen a lot throughout my career as well. And there's a lot of damage that does, like a lot of unspoken damage, I think. And then it kind of fosters this like anti-pattern of trying to figure out how to get credit for the things that did happen in the sprint, right? Everybody wants to show that we were working, even though it might look like we failed and didn't meet our sprint goal or what we committed to for the sprint. But so now can we get like partial credit for our story points, or right? Like there's all this trickle down, I think, that happens from the psychology of feeling like your sprint failed, that you end up kind of gaming the wrong things inside the sprint to try to make that look better. So I think it's really interesting that there was like that leap, right, for them of feeling like, okay, this is like a bunch of small wins, maybe, instead of feeling like you have to find success at the end of the sprint. So I think that's really interesting. You talked about the prioritization piece. Was when you went into one bigger team, was it one product person then for all of the work for that bigger team, or was it a collaborative effort there in terms of prioritization?
The model at Ultimate, we actually were paired at multiple levels. So at the VP level, there was a VP of engineering, there was a VP of product. There were directors on the engineering side, there were directors on the product side. And I would say a director on the product side was responsible for multiple areas that may be related. So, like payroll and compliance, there would be one director of those areas. And then underneath them on the product side, there were product managers. And a product manager tended to have a team. So like the 25 person payroll or compliance team, a product manager had those. And then within the team, we had BAs, and the BAs had a little bit more specialization, right? So you might have someone who focused on the payroll engine. You might have someone who focused on the compliance side. So they were, the PM is probably where the bulk of the prioritization was happening, right? They were saying, these are the, at least in feature order, here's where I need stuff. And then they handed that off to the BAs who dealt with the story breakdown and titration of how do we balance the stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. So for that team or any of the other teams, as they started to adopt more Kanban practices, did they have any misconceptions about Kanban that they had to unlearn or start from scratch in terms of where the practices were introduced?
I mean, I think the biggest misconception, and I think it's still out there. I guess there's two for me. One, Scrum had commitments. Kanban doesn't have commitments, right? That's
Yeah,
probably be the biggest one.
that's still, I think, a big misconception. We run into that all the time.
Yep. And then the other would be Kanban is really useful for maintenance, but not really for pure development work. And those were probably the two biggest ones that I think we had to deal with. And I think, like you said, I think those are still big things that have to be dealt with in an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. On the commitment side of things, let's talk about dates and forecasting. I know we use some of the examples from Ultimate as examples of how to do continuous forecasting and really keeping tabs on when work will get delivered and maybe even more importantly, how much risk is shifting around the dates that you're setting. So how did you start to use all of the data you were collecting to introduce forecasting?
Yeah, and so prior that I was living in a world where as the release was coming up for the teams that I could see were closer to not making their dates or I guess there was a higher level of risk. I was like calculating averages every day, right? Like, oh, yesterday they closed 3 stories and they've still got 20 to close. I think with the number of days we're okay. And so I lived that world for a couple of years. And then around that time, the tooling and the mindset, I would say, in the industry had kind of started to shift away from we're just about visualization, we're just about physical boards to we're going to actually create some rich tooling to help us answer this stuff. And so a couple things started. Like I think the first thing was people were starting to use the cumulative flow diagrams, which was like interesting, and it was the first time we started to see that level of visualization. But the real eye opener was when we started to see the use of Monte Carlo, right? And using Monte Carlo as the tool to predict when things will be completed. So around that time, I had brought Vacanti in, who I'd met, and known for years. But I brought Dan in, and that's kind of where I wanted to go. Was like I wanted to be able to use Monte Carlo to predict when things would get done. And so the meeting that I mentioned earlier that we had every day, the daily product review, we ended up tying all of the data coming out of Jira, because we did use physical boards. We evolved to using a combination of physical boards back-ended by Jira and then to just using Jira essentially. But as the tooling got more rich, we were able to start to tie together the dashboard that we use to drive that daily product review with Monte Carlo simulations. And as data was changing in Jira, we were able to almost like I think we were at 15 minutes is where we started. Every 15 minutes, we had an update on what was the likelihood of completion for this release for this team, and almost down to the features we could see of what were the likelihood of success. And so we could go into that meeting every day and say, and we color coded it, right? So we used green, yellow, red. And if we didn't really need to talk about teams that were in green, but if you were in yellow or red, we had to have a conversation of, are you at risk of missing the deadline or the deliverable dates, and what are we going to do about it? And that's really the $1 million question is, right? It's great to know that it's green or yellow or red, but if you're yellow or red, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, we talk, I think a lot of times our gut reaction when we see things, when we see the risk increasing or the date, the date's now at risk, our first reaction is often, okay, well, now we need to change the date. And I think leadership can still end up with fatigue, right, from dates constantly changing. Even if you're using Monte Carlos to come up with those dates and you're forecasting based on past data, if your date's changing all the time, there's just a lack of confidence in those dates. And so I think what you just described is so important when we think about how to communicate with stakeholders, that if we instead say, okay, now this has we forecasted this at an 85th percent likelihood of hitting this date, but now we're at 40%. What do we want to do about it, right? We can have a really different conversation with our team, with our leaders to say, can we cut scope? Can we add more teams to this work? But a lot of times we take that conversation off the table if the only outcome is the date moving. So I love that example and that you brought those tools into meetings that already existed. I think that's another question I get a lot in coaching of, like, what meetings should we be setting up, or what kind of reviews do we need to have to review things like a continuous forecast? And I think bringing that to the meeting that already was in place probably helped you just have a better conversation with that context and with the people that were already there. Did you run into any skepticism behind the data or behind what the Monte Carlos were putting in front of that team in those daily product reviews?
Oh, even from the teams themselves. Like it was a pretty common pattern that the Monte Carlo would tell us, okay, you can commit to 50 stories. And we would have the leader of the team tell us, I know it says that, but no problem. I can get 90 stories done. I know I can get 90 stories done. And we would guide them like, hey, you shouldn't do that. You're going to overcommit yourself. You're committing to too much. Like, we don't want to. I'm okay about stretch goals, but just know if you commit to this much, I'm going to hold you accountable to that much, right? Like, we're telling you every bit of data we have says you can't do that. You're telling me you think this case is different, therefore you're going to take the gamble. And I'm just telling you, if we're going to go and tell the business you're going to take that gamble, you're going to have to do something. You're going to have to pull some extraordinary measures in order to get it done if that's not going to be the case. Are you committing to that? Yes, I'm committing to that. Okay. And then inevitably, if it was a 4-month release, sometime around month 2, they would come and say, okay, I can't get done what I said. And so then it was well, what are we going to do? Like, what's the conversation, right? And in the cases where it was just an overcommitment and there was no implication for the business, right? Of like, we're going to not be able to take a client live in time or something like that. It was a different conversation than you committed to this despite every bit of information we have saying you shouldn't. And now you're going to have to figure out how to get the team to work extra hours or to do whatever you're going to need to do, get help. We're going to have to solve that problem because you did commit to it.
And how about from a morale perspective? So you talked a little bit about, the efficiency, like the improvement around not having to coordinate a bunch of cross-team dependencies, but did morale of the team members improve?
Yeah, and I do think that's what drove a lot of the increase in throughput was just the teams were happier, the teams weren't missing deadlines, the teams weren't being interrupted the way they were frequently being interrupted. There were always going to be those, payrolls down for a client and we have to solve it immediately, but being able to plan for that stuff I think was just much better.
Yeah. Well, I know you said you didn't initially put throughput in front of the leaders and you focused more on cycle time. Was there a time where you shifted your focus to say, hey, look how much more work we're getting done? Or did you primarily use cycle time as the measure for stakeholder, like to show the stakeholders that it was helping?
Oh, within the leadership, we absolutely looked at throughput.
Okay.
I didn't put it in front of the teams.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't like the individual contributors. I didn't want them to realize that we were so focused on that because I didn't want them slicing things falsely or just trying to, oh, I can turn this thing that really should be one story into 5 stories because it looks better. That's what I was trying to avoid. So yeah, that was really my intent there. But there was a time. So this was all great. We were humming along. Everything was going fantastic. But like everything else, things left unattended, and they tend to slip over time. And what we were dealing with at Ultimate was massive, rapid growth. Right, we were probably adding 100 engineers a year to the team. At the same time, we had an internship program, which over summer probably had 50 interns, and in the normal school semesters had 25. And the business was changing, so we were constantly shifting things around to match the business. And so, at some point, what I realized was the processes within the teams had got a little stale. So the initial board design, the initial whip limits, all of that stuff was great for a period of time, but then people were just going through the motions because it had been set that way for a while, and they weren't changing things to evolve. Um, as we moved leaders around, and maybe a new leader had taken over the team, and maybe they felt a little uncomfortable to change something that had been working for so long. So we realized at some point, it was probably like in the 2000 and maybe 15 that's what we were suffering from was the entropy had set into our process the way it does into your engineering projects, and we needed to do something to solve that, and we didn't feel like we were getting as much throughput out of the entire team as we could. So again, we didn't go and ask the teams to double throughput. We asked them to cut cycle time in half. So we literally laid out a pretty audacious goal in an all hands meeting of like, this is our goal, is to cut cycle time. We're going to retrain teams. We're going to embed, and this was the first time we started to actually have dedicated coaching. Up to that point, we trained the lead of each team, but we didn't have a dedicated coaching team, and that made a huge, huge difference in taking all the teams back through the training, and making sure that not just the leader understood it, but that every single person on the team understood why we were choosing to do the things we were doing. Because if not, I felt like the common answer when you hit like a whip limit is, well, we should just raise the whip limit. Right,
Yeah.
like that was so common, and so we ended up locking that down and saying like teams couldn't change whip limits unless they went to like leadership to make that decision, because if not, you would go from, it would start off at 3 and you'd go back 3 months later and it would be 6 or 7, and that was the wrong direction to be heading in. But we did end up going back and sort of rebooting the Kanban process, and embedding or at least having embedded coaching available, and we were able to drive that cycle time down. We did see again a major improvement in throughput. Not, and this was the fascinating part, right? Because again, you can make things smaller but not actually deliver more.
Mhm.
So we were hyper focused on cutting cycle time of stories, but what we really monitored was how many features were we getting delivered to production, and we did see almost a 2x increase in features, and in some
Awesome.
cases it was way beyond that.
Yeah, you talked about how you didn't want people to game things if they knew you were tracking throughput. Were there any downsides or unintended consequences of setting that target with cutting the cycle time in half?
um, you know I think it's always that, if I guess if there's one thing you should be comfortable in this world, is actually making things smaller and actually cutting cycle time. But there's always the people who just don't understand that that's why you're doing that. So for them, it's a game of like, hey, I'm just, the work is the work is the work. It doesn't really make a difference whether I cut it into 3-day cycle time or 15-day cycle time. It's all the same, and they just don't see that. So there's just some people you have a hard time convincing, and that was probably the biggest thing. Like, we would embed with teams, they would think they were doing amazing because they had so much whip, and it was hard to convince them that cutting whip was the right thing to do. They would cut whip, they would see things get better. The coaches would be happy, the management would be happy, everybody would be happy. The embedded coaches would move on to another team, and despite knowing all of that stuff, the team would slowly revert back to not controlling whip the way they need to. And when you pull the leader aside and be like, hey, you really understood all this, help me understand what happened, they just didn't have a great answer. Of like, it's hard to say no. So when someone would come along, whether on the product side or anywhere else, they didn't know how to say, and the answer doesn't have to be no, it's not right now. But they didn't know how to say that, and so that stuff would creep back up. And then once it crept back up, they had a hard time controlling it until there was like an outside element, like a coach or someone who came back in and helped them get that back under control.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the power of of tracking flow metrics too, right? To be able to say, here's where we increased our whip, and here's the direct impact it had on your cycle time and throughput. Because I think it can be, we get busy, things get chaotic. I think you and I have talked about this with AI. I think there's the potential that AI is going to increase a lot of noise in our systems and a lot of volume in our systems. And without being able to show the impact it's having on your ability to deliver, I think it's easy to just be like, well, I don't know, sorry, we just had a bunch of stuff come in. So I think being able to connect it and show it with data really tells a more powerful story. And it kind of takes us out of the hot seat of trying to convince them why those limits are in place, right? Or why those limits are so important. Um, what if you were going to start a Kanban journey over today, either at Ultimate or at your current job or a future job, would you do anything differently?
There's probably two things I would do differently. The first was around the way we train the teams. And so I mentioned that when we made the switch to Kanban, we brought in sort of the external person. We trained the leads of each team. We didn't necessarily with that level of expertise train every single person on the team. And I think that is a little bit of a disservice, because when they don't have that information, and especially with what we were dealing with that massive growth, and like the leader of that team might be moving over to take on another project, and now you have the entire team who doesn't necessarily understand the nuances of things like, what does it mean when you raise a whip? What is the downstream effect of that, right? So I would want to be able to train every single person at that level so that they had that understanding, so that their gut reaction wasn't to raise things like whip limits. And then probably I would say the biggest learning is really all around focusing on aging of work items in progress, right? Like, we were so hyper focused initially on cycle time, which is all fantastic, but you're looking at with like the things like the cycle time scatter plot, you were always looking at things after they happened. So it was telling you a story of what had already happened, versus being able to use tools like Actionable Agile and look at the aging work in progress and highlight, hey, this thing is in jeopardy of exceeding my threshold for cycle time. what are we going to do about it in real time? So if I could go back and do anything, it would have been have tools like that to hyper focus on the aging of things in progress as they're happening. Because if I can do that, WIP is already sort of, or sorry, not WIP. My cycle time is already, is taken care of for me, and if that's taken care of, my throughput's taken care of. So those would be the two biggest learnings, I would say. That, and maybe there's a third that I didn't think of that I would say, adding coaching right up front, right? Like, had we had the ability to have those coaches focusing at that level, and helping the teams on an ongoing basis, rotating through, I think we wouldn't have seen those periods of time where we would have achieved the velocity levels we did and then saw it slowly regress and then have to chase it again. I think we would have just had that go continuously going at the level we would have wanted.
Yeah. Um, Well, and I think your point about work item age is one that we continue to talk to people about, both through classes or through coaching, because for all of the things that you're talking about with WIP and the psychology around train a limit WIP and people feeling like it's impossible or they can never say no, or they have no choice but to respond to all these incoming requests, I think work item age can be a great place for them to start, because we're not then making it like we're doing something to you or your ability to work. We're just really having a conversation about how long things are taking and whether or not that's a reasonable amount of time. And it works so great for Scrum teams too. It's not limited to Kanban,
Right.
at that, really in that way. So I think it's really turning into the place where I like to start, not just from a team level, but also, like you said, features. Feature level planning has turned into really a push for so many organizations, where it's like, okay, it's a new quarter, so we're going to jam 10 new features in, even though only 2 left, or without looking, pausing to look at how old those features are, or how long they've been in progress already. So it really is such a powerful metric and a great starting point for all different levels of the organization. We'll go to questions here from the audience in a moment, but what's next for you in terms of, where you're focusing or what things you're seeing in your current climate or current organization, and how do you think Kanban can help?
Yeah. I'm lucky that where I ended up after 20 something years at Ultimate, I'm with a group of people who I worked with at Ultimate, who took a lot of that work that we did and set up a very similar process in terms of using the Monte Carlo, focusing on cycle time, focusing on all the flow metrics. So it was a very natural transition for me over to working here. Um, I would say what's next is really going to be all around what's AI going to do for us. That's I know it's on everybody's mind. It's a little bit of an unknown of what is it really going to mean over the next few years. But that's probably, if I'm going to start looking into anything future facing, that's what it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's got questions about how that's going to look and how it's going to work. Because, like we said earlier, if the volume of code changes is going to increase overnight, having a stable process in place that can absorb that level of increase, right? You're increasing your WIP essentially. You want to make sure that you have a process in place that can handle that and manage still getting that work out the door. Otherwise, you just made your system a lot noisier and messier. With a lot of stuff that can't get shipped. So we're back to starting and not finishing, just because it's easier now to run through those changes, essentially. So, well, I'd love to hear from the audience. If you have any questions for Steve, go ahead and pop them into the chat here, and we'll run through some of the questions about his transformation experience and how he applied Kanban here at scale. Let's see if anything comes in. While we're waiting for any audience questions, Steve, has Kanban changed the way you think about work and process or priorities or delivering outside of engineering? Like, do you see patterns now where you're like,
Honestly, having two kids sort of my daughter's just finished out high school, but my son's a freshman, and trying to get them to control their WIP especially on the homework side of stuff, right? Like that's probably the biggest use of it for me, is just trying to say, hey, we're going to focus on, today we're going to spend this time focusing on math. Tomorrow we're going to focus on this other stuff. And so I do end up helping them apply that to their personal life more than anything else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I love
that
that.
and I suppose my honey-do list from my wife gets prioritized and tracked visually. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of it, right? Like, really what we're trying to do is have a conversation about trade-offs. So, like you said, it's not necessarily no that you're not going to do the stuff hitting your honey-do list, or that they can say no to doing their homework. It's really just a trade-off of what needs your focus right now, and is that the right thing? Are we trading off something we've already started or something that's in progress to switch gears? Sometimes the answer is yes. It has to be yes, but it's really just making sure that we're having a better conversation about the trade-off cost. Well, I don't see any questions coming in. Are you sure nobody wants to ask Steve any hard questions here about his time and his experience?
Colleen, you didn't say hard questions.
Hard questions, the hardest. Here we go. Any challenges you faced figuring out what the right WIP limits would be for your team of 25?
I would say we started off with what was a reasonable per person WIP limit, and then ebbed and flowed a little bit from there. But it was like, and for each team it was a little bit different because they could have third party dependencies where they may have to wait, or it could be all controlled by themselves. So as part of that initial setup, when we worked through or when we would go back and sort of reestablish, do the retraining with teams, we would always revisit their workflow and talk about WIP limits. But it was really always a function of how much stuff is reasonable for a person and what is the likelihood of this person going to be interrupted. There was no, I wish I could say we had some hard science we used at the time, but it was really just based on, we want people working on the least amount of stuff, but we don't want them stagnant, sitting idle.
Right.
That being said, our blocker was always on the QA side, right? So we were very comfortable to say, we're not going to let engineering pull more work than QA can test, which ended up forcing a lot of conversations from the engineers of, oh, I can't pull work because there's just no bandwidth in the overall. What can I do to help? Right. And that ended up having a lot of benefits of, oh, I see what they're struggling with. I can write a tool for help that, or I can write that script. It's a team sport, and getting them to realize that collectively together, those WIP limits help that. But there was no like real science that we used, at least initially, for setting of that stuff.
Yeah, it really is a lot of trial and error. And I feel like, we don't have a secret formula for it either, other than you need a place to start and you need to measure it, right? And see how it impacts everything.
I do think that the Get Kanban game was really a helpful exercise for people to go through and play that, and just even then see that like lowering WIP limits helps. So that's
Right.
probably, if I would suggest anything to anybody, I would say get a copy of that. There might even be digital versions of it now, I'm not sure, and learn to play that game and facilitate that with your teams.
Yeah, we do have a digital version of it for our classes at Pro Kanban. And I would say the nicest part, I mean, I loved the physical part of the board game, but I feel like everybody would get so stuck trying to do all the charts by hand that sometimes we spent more time debriefing where the charts went wrong than talking about the game. The nice part about doing the digital version these days is that it's all plugged into Actionable Agile, so we can just hop in and see real charts and real data, which is great. There's a follow-up to the WIP limit question. Did you have WIP limit at the, let's see, I can't quite read that one, in team level or at the team member level?
It was at column and team level.
Okay. So yeah, that's a great place to start. And that helps encourage some of that behavior around thinking about how we can all deliver together instead of individually. All right, next question here. I understand the forecast delivery ranges can become extremely wide and less actionable when using Monte Carlo with teams that are highly volatile. Have you encountered this, and how do you handle high volatility in the team's data?
So our main focus when we went in, especially once we got to the point where we had coaching, was to actually make the team stable and predictable. And so, once we did that, yes, the Monte Carlo was was more usable. It's still, I think, even for a high volatility team, I still think it's better than average. But our focus was really on how are we going to stabilize the team and make them predictable. more than anything else. And once we did that, the Monte Carlo became, obviously the best prediction tool we had.
And what kind of indicators in the data did you use to determine whether or not they were becoming more stable or less volatile?
It was really all about the scatter plot, cycle time scatter plot, being able to
Yeah.
use that, look at the, what was their cycle time, goal, what was their service level expectation, and then how far apart were their 85th and 95th, and what were we going to do to start driving all of that stuff down to a predictable level. That was our main focus, and once we did that, everything else sort of fell in place.
That was a test, by the way. You passed.
Oh, good.
Derek has a question here. With a large team, could anyone on the team pull any work? Sounded like there were still multiple teams under the umbrella as one team. Maybe I didn't hear it correctly.
Yeah, it started off with multiple teams under one umbrella. And that was the sort of this team of teams problem that I mentioned early on. But yeah, it did switch to a point where I don't want to say anybody could pull any work, because I don't believe that you can find a team of 100% generalists. I think there's always going to be some level of specialization. But we tried to widen that as much as possible so that we didn't have single points of failure, so that people could take PTO, and so that we weren't putting the business at risk by having that. So yeah, it's not anybody, but we definitely got to a point where we had more than one person and several people on the team who could take on anything else, which was we actually had that, there's always that nightmare scenario of the person who's responsible for one of the hardest areas of the code gets hit by the bus that everybody talks about. We had that scenario happen, and it wasn't a bus, but we definitely lost someone who was really key to us, to a tragic accident, and we ended up, getting ourselves into a situation where we would never have that problem again by having those larger teams and able to absorb a lot of that work.
Yeah. Yeah, you never really want that to actually happen, but I feel like we do talk about that scenario quite a bit. And it's like, how can we keep tabs on sharing that work, being aware of the work, making it all visible so that you can jump in when you need to?
Yeah.
Manny has a question for you, Steve. Is there a WIP limit at the project level? We're down from 10 to 5 projects in flight at one time.
We never got to a point where we had initiative or project level. One thing we did, we have, at some point, we were still, this would have been years before COVID, we were still co-located. We actually put up a very large physical feature wall in front of where all the execs sat. And so it was at a team level and just at a feature level. And so you could see all of the things that were in progress. If they were blocked, we actually created these like transparencies that would sit over the ticket that would say blocked for security reasons or blocked by a vendor. And we ran like that for a while. So the idea there was that, the executive team could go out and say, hey, I'm pushing for this new thing for the compliance area or payroll, but I can see what their WIP limit looks like, right? I can see how many features they have in progress. And I realize that in asking for this, I have to be willing to put these other things on hold or say we can cut these things. So we did that, but we didn't actually put an explicit limit on that stuff. I actually think it's a great idea. I think I've never seen a company where the executive team would buy into that.
Yeah, I miss those days of having the physical boards too, especially for that leadership level, because you have the ability to have those conversations more on the fly. And more before, like you said, before you're getting into a planning cycle or trying to pull more work into the system, it's really easy to see what's currently in flight and where it's at. And hopefully drive those conversations out sooner about the trade-offs again. The next question for you is, what was the hardest belief or habit for senior leadership to unlearn when moving away from frameworks and towards flow?
I still think there's the executive privilege problem that exists, right? Of like, whether it's the CTO, whether it's someone who has a call with a customer and who like wants to just drop into the team and drop work in there that's immediate. That has always been, and I still think, the hardest thing to break. But as much visualization as we could put in place to see this is what we're working on, by asking what you're asking, what are you willing to DQ and deprioritize? And so everything was built around how do we visualize and make decisions as early as possible. But I still think executive privilege is one of the hardest things to tackle.
Yeah. Yeah, because no one's going to say no either,
Right.
right? The privilege of asking, and then the flip side of it is nobody's going to say no to an executive that's coming to ask them to do something directly. So, one more question for you: were retros to identify continuous improvements conducted, and if yes, what was the cadence?
Um, we did we did keep at some level some of the, initially at least, the scrum ceremonies, right? Like we still had a daily stand up. Planning kind of switched to be more of a real time planning, but we did have the initially the 2 week retros. I will say early on the physical board, any story that the team felt needed a retro, we actually had a little avatar that we would just tack onto it. And as
Nice.
the story closed, they would just kind of queue up, hey, we've got these 5 that need a retro. And they would do them sort of more in real time. And then as the cadence of sort of the scrum ceremonies disappeared, we just employed real time retros. I will say one of the bigger things, though, in terms of driving continuous improvement, was getting away from the retros of the conversation. When I was, still embedded in scrum teams, I remember at the retros were always like, oh, we worked really well as a team together, we had problems coordinating with other teams. Like it felt very repetitive. And so we evolved our retros to be sort of, just in time, when needed, but data driven, right? So we would actually pull up things like the cycle time scatter plot and look at, hey, for the things that went above the 85th or 95th, let's have a conversation of why this took so long and what we could potentially do about it for next time. What are the lessons learned? How do we not have that repeat?
Yeah, it's such a more powerful, targeted conversation at that point too. And I think the other thing you can look at when you're trying to determine your cadence, like you said, Steve, keep it at 2 weeks if you're already doing them every 2 weeks. But for a lot of teams, when they start inspecting their cycle time data, they find out that their cycle time is higher than 14 days. Well, it's going to be hard for you to make changes every 14 days and see the impact if your cycle time's trending higher than that number anyway. So you might want to use your 85th percentile for your cycle time to indicate how often you should be doing reviews of the data, because then you'll have more data and you'll be able to tell the impact that changes are having on your cycle time and throughput as well. Love it. All right, well, we ended up with a ton of questions. Steve, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your story with our audience. For everybody listening, I hope you got something great out of this conversation. And if you'd like to share this recording with any of your peers, it'll be posted to the prokanban.org YouTube channel. We'll be back with our next Kanban for Everyone interview on May 22nd, same time, same channel. And we'll be having a conversation with Dan Vacanti about his updated Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability book. It's the 10th anniversary and a new edition of the book is out. So we'll be talking with Dan about what changes are in the book, what was coming up, what kind of prompted a new edition, and what he sees kind of as the future for forecasting and using metrics for predictability. Sorry, I misspoke. It's May 20th, not May 22nd. Link is in the channel if you'd like to RSVP for that talk. And again, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, everyone.